Welcome back to Lush Life, No Labels. I'm Fatu. This is a podcast where I talk about the struggles and joys of self improvement, anywhere from relationships, career, wellness, and more. The story of the week this week is actually based on an article that I read called Why It's Possible to Be Optimistic in a World of Bad News, written by Sumit Paul Chaudhry. This article was very interesting because it actually explores the nature of negative news and provides insight into how to maintain an optimistic mindset despite it. In the article, the author talks about negativity bias and how that leads us to thinking pessimistically. For example, if a car accident happens, everyone stops and stares because there's a bit of bias there towards a disaster. The author suggests that while the media often highlights negative stories, it's essential to recognize the broader context of human progress and resilience, which is hard to do in what seems like a chaotic world. So, I'm going to use that article as a jump off point for my discussion today, which is going to be around being optimistic in a world of chaos. And specifically, I'm going to talk about this in the lens of media. A lot of the things that I talk about in this lens of media can be applied to other situations in life. As someone who's become optimistic in the last few years, this article puts words into a perspective I've vaguely heard of before, specifically when it comes to optimism in the media. Fun fact about me, I used to be heavily pessimistic, especially at points where I felt so much was going wrong in my life. When I'd lost hope in myself and in my abilities, those were really the moments where it was really hard to think about better things because I didn't know a way out of the negative. So I always thought negatively. I thought about what could go wrong, and I would ruminate and replay the hypothetical bad scenarios in my head. And at that time in my life, it was easier to do that than to think positively because so many things were going wrong. My mindset was always in that negative. The antonym of pessimism is optimism, which is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as, quote, hopefulness and confidence about the future or the successful outcome of something. The type of optimism discussed in this article is actually one called Leibnizian optimism, which is desired as, quote, that might not be a perfect world containing no suffering or evil, but it would be the best of all possible worlds. For example, while the world's industrial revolution led to many developments such as steam engines and cars, it also led to faster climate change as a consequence. Another example here, while we've created a number of digital devices that has allowed me to access the article that I talked about previously online, or you, the listener, to even listen to this podcast, our interactions have reshaped our society, and the presence of these digital devices, although they have their positives, there can also be some negative sides to how we actually build these devices out of lithium that's mined from a number of countries that are exploited, and also some of the negative effects that we can have from being online. Essentially, the article and the author state that this type of optimism, quote, reminds us that we cannot see or understand the whole design of the world. And if we attempt to fix one problem at one time and place, there will likely be consequences elsewhere that we can't anticipate. The way I interpret this is that although optimism is looking towards the positive in a strict sense, the world that we live in is binary. There's not necessarily one innovation that is only positive or is only negative. There are both good and bad parts to those types of things. And that's how the author encourages the reader to reframe their mindset. Now, why does the world feel overwhelmingly negative? Well, the role of the media in shaping our perception of reality is a huge part of this. This is one where drama and toxic stories sell more than fruity, happy ones. For example, if you watch reality TV shows, a lot of the reality TV shows that focus on dating, for example, those are heavily influenced by the level of drama that are in the show. If you have someone in one of those shows who's not really dramatic, they're pretty calm and cool, they're probably not going to be popular in that TV show. The people who are screaming and yelling and doing all of this stuff, they bring the drama and they're the ones who actually become quote unquote more famous than the quieter people. Similarly, most of the front page news across newspapers, television, etc., provide negative news. Oh, there's a war happening here. Oh, here are all of these disagreements between governments. We may even build more pessimism as we hear about the layoffs that are occurring across companies in retail, tech, pharma, or any industry that we work in. Specifically within the last 2 years as well, in the US, there has been much more coverage of big accidents and natural disasters that are happening. So, a lot of the things that we see when we read any of the major newspapers is mostly negativity. I say this because I read the news, as we probably all do. And while I see these negative things, I also specifically try to look for some positive news. And honestly, y'all, it's so hard to do. I have to dig through a lot of negativity to even find one news article that's positive, because more negativity gets more clicks. And that actually grows the negativity bias that we have, which is why our brains focus more on bad news than good news. We focus on the bad news because it reinforces the negative mindset that we already have. The impact of something like doom scrolling can also impact our mental health and our outlook. If we're constantly seeing negativity, especially online or on social media, we will be thinking negatively because that's what we're exposed to. And I also think that that leads into more fear-based narratives that influence our emotions and our decision making. So even when we get up, we're not thinking positively. We're thinking, oh no, what's going to be the next disaster that the news tells us about? It's often a cycle that is hard to get out of, especially in a world where we're being bombarded by so much news and so much media. Optimism is key here to changing our mindset. Oftentimes, progress can get overlooked. For example, reduction in poverty across the world, medical advancements, technological innovations. Those things are real things that we have progressed in the world and we've made better. And a lot of those things are part of our everyday lives. However, we don't put as much weight on those types of progress as we do with a war that is happening in the world. We don't think about the level of resilience that humanity has in the face of crisis. Think about COVID. A lot of us in different states in the US, were in areas where everything was shut down. I lived in Massachusetts and we shut everything down. And I remember they said, oh, if we see you outside after a certain time, especially in those first few months, they said they would charge us at least $500 for seeing us outside and not social distancing. And yes, COVID was difficult and the world had not seen anything to that level, especially with the large population that we have now compared to previous pandemics. But we lived through that, or at least a lot of people did. I know not everyone did, but that to me is still a show of resilience that the human race went through. Another type of optimism that I don't see people talk about enough is the power of collective action and grassroots movements. For example, I mentioned climate change earlier as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, which is daunting on a global scale, but we forget that there are many different community groups in places like where I live, for example, where people do come together to do things like neighborhood cleanups to help manage waste, or to discuss how can they be more sustainable and how can they use less energy that would contribute to some of this climate change. The fact that most people are doing good things in their communities every day is what we should focus more on. The fact that there are people mentoring the youth in a world where these youth may not have the connections or the network to learn is very important and very positive. I went to a gala a few weeks ago by a Black engineering group where they partner with different companies to give scholarships to high school and college students. That's a beautiful thing. And those are the types of things that I wish the media would highlight, but it doesn't. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it really does not. People doing things in their everyday community is not necessarily highlighted in the media, but those are things that I know about. And I give these examples because having optimism does not mean that we ignore the realism of the world or that we avoid reading about the news. To me, it means adjusting my mindset. If I can spend my energy thinking about all of the worst things that can happen and the things that are going on now, then what's really stopping me from thinking the best? When I am bombarded by negativity around me, I actively seek out the positives. Now, how do you actually change your mindset to be more optimistic than pessimistic? One, consuming news mindfully. This is where balancing awareness with mental well-being comes in. Yes, it's important to check the news and make sure that, especially as adults, that we are well informed about what's going on around us, state-wise, federal-wise, globally. However, you do not need to be reading the news every single second of every single day. It's okay to not read the news for a few hours or for a day. If something really goes wrong, trust me, you're going to find out. Just from us having phones and being so connected, there's nothing that you're going to miss if you just take a break from reading the news. Another thing that I do, as I mentioned before, is seeking out positive stories. So focusing on solutions and progress in the news. For example, I read an article the other day about the right to repair law and how a number of different states have passed this law. If you don't know, the right to repair law allows local mechanics, local companies to be able to receive information from a manufacturer to help them either fix somebody's car, their phone, any other of these types of technologies that includes some software that a mechanic may not necessarily have. In the past, manufacturers essentially lobbied so that they were the only people with that information and that they were the only people who could fix anything that broke. However, this law allows less monopolization of literally fixing technologies and allows local people to be able to go and get their things fixed in a timely manner and at a reasonable price instead of having to wait for the manufacturer to do all of that, which would take a lot longer and probably would cost the consumer a lot more. That's an example of a positive news story that I don't really see people talk about. Another way to shift your mindset from pessimism to optimism when it comes to the news is really shifting your attention to what's going right, which is practicing gratitude. Even if anything, yes, I have days where it seems like everything is going wrong. It seems like things are not going my way. But one thing I like to keep in mind, which one of my aunts tell me, is I'm grateful for the life that I have. And truly, I am. I probably tell myself that once a day. I am grateful for the life that I have. Because my life used to be much worse than it is. It could be worse. However, I'm grateful for the life that I have. And to me, just saying that increases my mindset away from negativity, even if I feel like everything is going wrong. Taking action in terms of doing more service, for example, in your community or getting involved with mentorship, anything like that is also another great way to become more optimistic. Because if you're seeing yourself helping your neighborhood, picking up trash, helping the youth, helping the elderly, any of those types of things, you can really see yourself in a position bringing positivity to someone else's life. And that to me is very powerful, because one of the things that we lose ourselves in with the media is, oh, all of these bad things are going on, or oh, here's another thing that's going to tank the economy. And oftentimes we might feel hopeless. We might feel that we have no control, and we might feel that things are just happening to us. But if you are doing something personal to you in your community, getting involved, then you can see that you have a lot of control. You can help other people, and you can also help yourself. Yes, there are things that are out of our control, but there are so many things, especially in our day-to-day lives, that are in our control. And even with all of that, becoming involved, surround yourself with people who are like-minded. Surround yourself with people who are positive influences. Because when you surround yourself with people who are positive influences, it kind of rubs off on you. You start thinking similarly to them. You start seeing, oh, maybe there's another way to think about it. Oh, why does that person act like this? I should ask them. So I do think that surrounding yourself with people like that can also help you. If it's difficult for you to change your mindset, then at least being around other people can help you to slowly start seeing other ways for you to think. Again, these types of things that I'm saying is not necessarily something that is the easiest thing to do, but it's just small shifts that can help you start reframing the way that you think, especially if you feel bogged down by all the negativity that you see in the media. Now, when I started shifting from being a full-on pessimistic and walking my way towards the way of optimism, I had to be very intentional. I used some of the techniques I mentioned just now in shifting my mindset, but it was also about catching myself in the moments when I was being pessimistic, since that's what my brain was used to. I even did something where if I had one pessimistic thought, then I had to acknowledge two optimistic thoughts. Part of that was seeing the beauty in the world. I'll give you a simple example of something that I did. During the pandemic is really when I decided I'd had enough of myself and my negative thoughts, and I wanted to make some life changes, which started with changing my mindset. We all lived through the pandemic, and as you may remember, it was hard for most of the world to be positive in those days. And even looking back on it, of course, there was a lot of negativity. A lot of people died, unfortunately. One thing, though, that I started doing was literally, and I kid you not, I would just call out every time the sun shined. I'd be like, oh, the sun's shining today. That's great. Even though, all of these other things are going on. Just doing that every day, even when I didn't feel like it, just the acknowledgement of, yep, the sun is out and it's shining. That motivated me to start taking walks around my neighborhood so that I could just be in the sun. It was one of the very few things I could do anyways, living in Massachusetts during the lockdown. I started noticing flowers in people's gardens when it became springtime and wanted to capture them on camera. I don't know. Those days gave me a lot of life in an environment where everything was otherwise depressing and none of us knew what was ahead. This was before vaccines or anything. I share that story not to say that I'm completely reformed. I sometimes, of course, get overwhelmed with the news and the things going on in my life, but starting simply took the pressure off a little bit. I didn't have as much energy for simple positivity, so I needed to gradually build my way to other forms of optimism, and I'm still doing that to this day. If you've listened to this podcast before, you'll notice a theme I acknowledge is that self-growth is hard. It's not a snap of the fingers and all of a sudden you're the person you're striving to be. Any of us, me included, who decide we want to improve, no matter how big or small, we have to be willing to put in the work. A lot of us want to change, but we might not be willing to put in the work that's required to be that change person. Even when I wanted to be more optimistic, like I said, I started simply, but there were days when I was not optimistic, when the sun would be out and I would see it, but I just could not bring myself to say it or acknowledge it because I was so bogged down by my negative thoughts. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, you are what you eat. Well, I believe we are what we consume. And of course, how we think drives us. If we only have negativity driving us, or we're only exposed to negative news, that can seep into our behaviors and impact how we internally feel or how we present ourselves to others. Same with positivity. If we think it, we unconsciously and consciously begin to display that. But it's important not to just think positivity and forget the reality of the world. By acknowledging advancements and the positives of the world, even if it's something as small as, oh, the sun was shining today, we can balance our mindsets. That's really the key here. It's not to go on one extreme or the other of optimism versus pessimism. It's really that we want to build hopeful perspectives even when being presented with constant negative news. Because honestly, the truth of the matter is we won't fully shield ourselves from all negativity. And as adults, we are likely watching the news more than we did when we were growing up. And it is important to stay informed, but we can learn to manage that better over time. If we're lost in all of this, it's so much harder to pick ourselves up. Try to call out one or two positive things every single day. Just start with that. That may not solve everything, but to me, that would be a great start. Because thinking one or two positive things a day is better than not thinking anything positive at all, because I guarantee you, you're being thrown a lot of negativity. So why not just consider it and see how that goes? I challenge you to find and share one positive news story this week with a friend or a family member. Think about how it made you feel to read that news story, because really the way that you feel is going to be that important part. And I hope that that encourages you to continue to search for these positive news in a sea of everything that is going on. Here's to more optimism and more positivity. Thanks again for listening to Lush Life No Labels. Like and subscribe to my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Episodes come out every Thursday morning. Cheers to your lush life and see you later.